Good evening, Binghamton. It is with great humility that I introduce my two guests tonight to participate in this forum on radicalism and free speech and the conflicts that arise from the Christian Institute. Christopher Hitchens is one of the country's best-known controversial writers. He has been a columnist for The Nation, Slate, Vanity Fair, and is a frequent contributor to The Atlantic, the New York Times Book Review, and many other publications around the world. He has published prolifically, and his most recent books include God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, and Thomas Jefferson, Author of America. Richard Landis is a professor at Boston University and is co-founder and director of the Center for Millennial Studies. He has published many books, including The Peace of God, Social Violence, and Religious Response in France on the Year 1000, and Relics, Apocalypse, and the Deceits of History. He maintains two websites, Second Draft and Out in Stables, which focus on media coverage of the Muslim-West conflict. He frequently contributes articles on the subject in various publications, including the New Republic. Tonight's forum, which I will moderate, will focus on radical Islam's assault on free speech. I will pose questions to one of our guests, and after he addresses it, the other will have a chance to respond. Incidentally, I should mention that we have the unique privilege of having two guests that have a wide range of knowledge on many subjects. I will try to keep this discussion reasonably focused, but if we veer off course, we hope you nonetheless enjoy our discussion. Lastly, I would like to thank the Leadership Institute, the David Project, Hasbro Fellowships for making this event possible. Tonight's debate is also sponsored by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and part of its Cicero Podium's debate series on great issues. The series travels the country seeking to elevate civil discussion, promote gender and intellectual diversity on its campuses, and inspire the rising generation to think about the books and ideas that have shaped our experience in liberty. To learn more about ISI, to become a student or faculty member for free, please take Literature Outsiders on the website isi.org. We are passing our most importantly, thanks to my good friends both at Binghamton Review and those who act independently for helping out in review our and without further ado, I give you Christopher Hitchens and Richard Landis. The first question will go to Mr. Hitchens. Thomas Jefferson produced a version of the New Testament eliminating the miracles and the fantastic elements. As I understand, he attempted to extract the humanistic, ethical, and moral teachings that could be used as a secular document in moral compass. Do you agree with this assessment? And further, do you agree with the moderate Islamic view that the Quran offers similar potential?
Was the question heard and understood by all present? It was. Good. Because it is to me an incredibly upsetting question, in that I would not ever want to come before any audience, let alone a learned one like this, and say, on any subject, that I preferred C.S. Lewis to Thomas Jefferson. Yet the facts must be faced, and they must be looked squarely in the face. Mr. Jefferson took a New Testament in one hand, and a razor blade, picture in another, and scissored out, or cut out, all the verses of the New Testament that were supernatural, magical, superstitious, incredible, peasant-oriented, stupid, and all the rest of it. And leaving in only a couple of sermons here and there, was left with a very, very short book, as we say, which you may purchase or get probably for free, actually, from the Unitarian Church in your local division of faith. It used to be, I won't make this too long an answer, but I hope to interest you in these matters. It used to be that every newly elected congressman, on the day they took their oath in Washington, was given a copy, a free copy by the Speaker of the House. of the Jefferson model, the resulting. And Forrest Church, the son of Senator Frank Church, these being the leading family members of the Unitarian American Confession, will give you this, the Jefferson Bible as it's called, on that basis. Now, Jefferson said that once you take out the magic, the madness, the insanity, the superstition, the nonsense, the contradictions, you're left with a great moral teaching. Now, just contrast this for a second with what is said by C.S. Lewis, who I would suppose to be the best-known Christian apologist in the United States. Am I wrong? I mean, who here has not heard of C.S. Lewis? Who has not heard of the Chronicles of Narnia and all the rest of it? Who hasn't
read the Greek?
Who hasn't inhaled briefly the thought of the sacrifice of a lion, better than human sacrifice, purchases the redemption of sin, and all the other garbage that's associated with the Narnia Chronicles and Lewis's essays with mere Christianity. Well, what Lewis says is this, and I agree with him, and I prefer him to my favorite president of biographical subject, Mr. Jefferson. Lewis says, if you believe in that, you'll believe in anything. You must be serious about it, says Lewis. Lewis says, either you believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or you don't. And if he was not the Son of God, if his claim was false, then his preachings were evil. Not false, not wrong, not misleading, not fictional, wicked. He says indeed, very clearly, says Lewis, if Jesus was not the Son of God, he was a devil from hell. Because how else can it be true that a man will come to you and say, abandon your family, leave your children, let them starve, leave your friends to die by the roadside, think nothing about investment or thrift or the future, or take no thought for tomorrow. Forget all that. Give it up. Follow me, only me, because the world is coming to an end in the next few weeks. If you aren't with me, you're going straight to hell. Now, that is either Jonestown, or Joseph Smith, or the Branch Davidians, or the recent roundup of the mad cult of the even more extreme Latter-day Saints. Or it is the word God, that you have no right to say, let's do it out of kind, let's do it cafeteria. The nice bits we like, the bad bits we'll leave. No. It's a horrible thing that I have to say. On this point, C.S. Lewis is more honest than Thomas Jones. You must either accept the mad claims of prophets that the end of days are coming, and that we must brace yourself for heaven to come, or you may not, as I don't, because those mad claims of the origins of dictatorship and totalitarianism and fascism, but you must have the moral courage to choose. And Jefferson didn't, and C.S. Lewis did.
Even if he chose wrong.
Even if he chose, as I would say, wrong. But the choice, the point is the choice. I don't say which choice you must make. I say you must make the choice. At least in that respect, I think I have the same courage as a believer would have to say. There's no soft option in this. You must either believe in divine intervention, in the supernatural presence, in the possibility that religion is redemptive, in the idea that you might have everlasting life, or everlasting torture, or not. But no cafeteria religion, please. You're here at the university to develop your intellectual and moral muscles, not to let them atrophy. And don't, anyone who follows the feel-good version of religion says, well, if it makes you feel better, why not? What can you lose? He's a moral hooligan. And probably paying money to a moral hooligan too, so he can buy himself another 10 minutes on the TV. Come on, don't waste don't waste your emotions. Don't waste your morality. Take it seriously or don't take it.
When you say that C.S. Lewis put this sort of dual choice before us, it seems to me there's a third choice, which is that as a historian working on apocalyptic movements, you can see him as the son of God, you can see him as the son of the devil, or you can see him historically as a mistaken apocalyptic prophet, which is that he's perfectly sincere and he really believes that the end of the world is at hand, that this is how we should behave at the moment before judgment. And that this has been the eternal appeal, and you could, in fact, make the same analysis about the origins of Islam. Muhammad comes with a message that the day of judgment is at hand, and that those who respond properly and accept Allah's rule over him is somebody who will be saved at the last judgment. And the scoffers are the ones who say, you're a devil.
Are you sure that that's exactly right then, analogically, in that it's been pointed out by many people that with Jesus, all of his disciples were perfectly convinced that he would come back from again from heaven in their own mind.
Well, I would agree that
that's not that Muhammad makes many false claims, but he doesn't make that one.
No, but Jesus didn't make that one.
Muhammad also doesn't make Muhammad, peace be upon him, does not make the claim. Does not make the claim to be the Son of God.
No, but
he doesn't make any profane or mad or blasphemous.
But the historical reading of
only Jesus of Nazareth makes the claim that you will see me again in your own life, and I will conduct you to my Father's house. Something that simply cannot be.
Okay, but the historical reading of that text is that this is an interjection subsequently by disappointed disciples who need to believe that Jesus is going to come back, and who, before he was crucified, believed that he would fulfill the messianic promises in his day. There was no need for a second coming until the crucifixion.
That's right. Logically, then, we face two choices. Jesus said, initially, I've come to fulfill the prophecies. So all I'm doing is being an Orthodox Jew. But I'm the one you were looking for. There's been a false Messiah in practically every epoch of Jewish history. The Jews are looking for a Messiah. Some of them will tend to find him. Tend to find one. But the false, because there are promises, there'll be people who will try and fulfill them. I'm trying to think of the easiest example. Well, he arrives in Jerusalem at Passover on a donkey because it's said that the Messiah will come on a donkey. So it is said in the Gospels. So it was done as it might be fulfilled, if you like. As if people can't tell reverse engineering when they see it.
Well, it sounds like a retrospective narrative.
Well, horoscopes are better. Now, the prophet Muhammad does not say, I'm the Son of God, does not say, I'm here to fulfill the prophecies. Indeed, he says, I'm here to say that at least half of what you read in the Christian and Jewish Gospels is true. The virgin birth is true. The resurrection isn't because the Jews crucified someone else instead. But he was a prophet. It's an elaborate plagiarism. As Christianity is a plagiarism of the old Jewish Mosaic.
I think basically, and I know that...
But once you understand that it's all text, and that it's all man-made, all mystery goes away. The only mystery is why anyone ever believed that it was divine.
I'd like to hear from the next question. Professor Landis, are all religious fundamentalists potential radicals and/or terrorists? Or is there something in the Islamic credo that allows or even encourages this process?
Okay. I would say that the issue of religious violence is a terribly important one that we all need to read about. I would encourage you, among other things, because I have many disagreements with them, but to read René Girard, J-I-R-A-R-D, Sacred Violence, to get a sense of the significant role that religious violence has played historically. I think that the idea that religious violence can be banished is in fact a messianic one, and I think that it's it's terribly important for us to understand and domesticate rather than to eliminate or try and eliminate or believe that we have eliminated religious violence. I think that one of the keys to religious violence is related to the issue of what anthropologists used to call honor-shame cultures. It's a subject that more or less got banished by Edward Said as being racist. But I think that it's terribly important to understand the significance of issues of honor-shame. We all want honor, we all want to avoid shame, but there are cultures in which it's not only allowed, but it's expected and in some cases even required that you shed somebody else's blood for the sake of your honor. To save face, it is legitimate to aggress somebody else. And I think that a lot of religious violence is in fact an expression of honor-shame dynamics through a religious voice. And I think that we saw that, for example, with the Muhammad cartoon controversy, the Pope's remarks and so on, that you have this violent reaction that comes because you feel insulted. And, essentially the political correctness, particularly since World War II, and certainly since the civil rights movement in the 60s that I lived through, you don't go out and humiliate people on purpose. You don't call them dirty names. That's inappropriate public behavior. So we respect other people's feelings. But then we have a problem when you're dealing with a situation in which any kind of criticism, for instance, the remarks that Christopher Hitchens just made about Christianity, if it were said to one of my medieval audiences, he wouldn't be here right now. And as I start all my classes on heresy and Inquisition, two things would be different if this were the Middle Ages. There would be no women, and I would have been burned as a heretic a long time ago. So the ability to tolerate criticism is a critical dimension of modern society, and I think that lots of forms of religious fundamentalism, not just Islam, but I think right now Islam is in a particularly painful situation, which we could discuss, but I'm not going to go into it right now, means that they are Muslims, and this is true, I think, around the world, but probably more in non-Western countries, are particularly sensitive, and therefore criticisms of Islam are seen as assaults on Muslim identity. Modernity, I think, registers as an assault on Muslim identity. And so I think you have a tendency right now for more violence amongst Muslims. Then there's the other dimension, which we can probably go into later, which has to do with jihad and has to do with the sort of permanent transformation of sensitivity into aggression. That's a particular form that this kind of religious feeling can take. But I think that essentially fundamentalism is not necessarily or inherently violent by any means. I think that some of the motivations for becoming fundamentalists are motivations that, particularly under circumstances of disappointment or humiliation, can lead to violence.
If I may interrupt,
I was wondering how long it was going to go on. I mean, look, sorry, is my turn?
Yeah.
Well, no, you're the chair. Well, I was raised in a polite household, and I teach at a major university in New York, and I'm a person who goes to writers' conferences, so I know what etiquette is, but this situation, in order to be a monotheist, in the knowledge that we have, certain knowledge we now have, that the human race is at least 100,000 years old, possibly a quarter of a million years old, and not less than 100,000. Traces of its civilization, 80, 75,000. I hope there's no one here who doesn't know what this believes like. And this is admittedly very recent. In order to be a religious person, a monotheist, you must believe that heaven, paradise, the divine supervisor watched the first 75 or 80,000 years of this with indifference and decided only to intervene in human affairs 2,000 to 3,000 years ago in remote and illiterate parts of the world. That's what you have to believe to be a monarch. To be a Jew, a Muslim, or Christian, that's what you must believe. That we lived that long, those tens of thousands of years, and heaven watched with indifference as we died, suffered, went through hell, expectation of life, often 30 years. Finally decided time for integration. Well, if you can believe that, you can believe it. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be told I must respect it. I'm not. I think anyone who believes that is a fool. In the worst conditions the human race has ever undergone, the lowest point of its education and cultural level, no intelligent person could ever have proposed such a stupid thing. But I'm going to demand, if respect is going to be demanded, that I get respect too. That it's no worse for me to say that, what I've just said, than it is for someone to say, no, you don't understand. History begins when God first speaks to Muhammad through the archangel Gabriel. In a cave, in Arabic only. Now, you may not interrupt, because I'm just going to... This being the case, why should there is a direct implication of what Professor Landis just said, and I cannot believe it's the implication he wanted me to draw. But the implication was that if someone here not liking what I just said threatened to kill me or use violence against me for saying it, that would be my fault. I would have invited violence. No, I'm sorry. There was I know we're being recorded. Well, you'd better. Okay. But you also better, you'd be doing much better to apologize. Because what you said a moment ago will be available on tape tomorrow. You will notice that if violence was offered for what I've just said, I would have brought it on myself, on your analysis. I would have invited or encouraged someone to threaten or use force to shut me up. Now, I will not agree. I did not emigrate to this country to be told, living under the protection of the Constitution of the First Amendment, that if I exercise my right of free speech and someone doesn't like it and proposes to kill me for saying so, that I have become the author of my own self-destruction. Excuse me, I won't be talked to in that tone of voice by anybody, and neither should anybody on any university campus in these United States. They should instead say our right of free speech is absolute and is protected against any threat, clerical or otherwise. And I'm sad to see a few of you want to applaud that. But I can live without your support, because I don't fucking need it. Now, is that absolutely clear? Because if that's clear, I don't need to say anything else, or none. I can fold my arms. Anyone else can say or ask anything they wish. I've made the only point I wanted to.
Thank you. But the question that I asked about 15 minutes ago was actually very specific, not whether God exists or whether we should respect one another. I don't quite see how it got to this point, but the original question was very simply, do religions differ in their approach to criticism? And I don't want to group all of them together and say, how is this?
No, I was answering the question as answered by my vis-a-vis, Professor Landis. Your question is a perfectly good question. As to when religions feel they can or cannot kill, torture, or blackmail, or silence those who disagree with them, it depends what epoch you're talking about. There was a time the Catholic Church was by far the most repressive and aggressive church. Went on for a very long time too. In Northern Ireland, I would say the Presbyterians were more aggressive and repressive than the Catholics, or had been in the last few decades. As they are in the southern states of this great republic. However, there's, I think, very little doubt at all that currently the religion that most identifies itself with self-hatred self-righteousness and self-pity, and that considers it has the right to use violence against people of its feelings, is Islam. It's Islam, and it's very important that everyone says that will not stand.
All right, Christopher, can I agree with you here a second?
Only if you must. I'd rather disagree.
You'd rather
Given what you said,
better things.
Given what you said before, I'd rather disagree.
The point that I'm making here is that the conditions of modernity, the conditions of tolerance, means that we raise our level of tolerance for criticism to the
Inappropriate public behavior.
Where we don't engage in violence because somebody's hurt our feelings. It seems to me, part of the maturity of modernity is to be able to tolerate criticism without getting violent. So I take that as the ground rule. And I'm describing what I consider to be, in some sense, this modern behavior as the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages.
You want to go first?
I consider it a mature stage of religion, and not all religions, and not all members of various religions. It's just that level of maturity. Well, look, you know, to take the Christian example, which Christopher, you must be familiar with, throughout the Middle Ages and throughout the early Reformation, first century, after the Reformation, essentially, whichever group became the majority imposed their will on everybody else. That's why you get the Inquisition and so on. So the American Revolution, which had its millennial conventions, and the American Constitution is the first time in the history of Christianity that tolerance is the credo of the winners. That's a tremendous moment in the history, I would say, of mankind. When we talk about the Shahada around the world, freedom of religion is one of those extraordinary accomplishments, which I think...
Wait, you said of American Christianity?
Yes, of American Christianity.
Surely you meant to say of American secular.
I'd say of American
You cannot possibly say that the Constitution is a document of American Christianity.
Oh, yes.
It certainly derives from it.
You will say that in the face of this audio.
Didn't we address that in the first question?
No, we didn't.
Derives from it?
We might as well. You are saying to me that the United States Constitution is a document of Christianity.
Yes.
Very well. As long as you won't say later that you didn't say that.
I will say later. I mean, we can, you know, I don't want to get Lincolnian about this.
I know
We
you
can argue
the
about what I mean by
sideways
gay or what I mean by Christianity.
You're stuck to that statement now.
Okay.
That's all I want. It's for you, ladies and gentlemen, to look at the Constitution and ask yourselves, is the statement of Christian doctrine or Christian command? I don't need.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to the next question before it's okay. This is for Professor Linus. Political correctness has become a presence on the national scene and on college campuses, and is particularly pernicious when it comes to issues of race. And it is used to stifle political correctness, that is used to stifle open discussion of controversial subjects. And a common example is in rap and hip-hop culture. It's fine to say, you know, into this, vote that, but the minute Imus says the same thing, he loses his job. Now, I see a parallel between this and radical Islam's inability to allow dissent. What is your opinion on this parallel of intolerance?
Well, right. I mean, I think this relates to the issue that we're discussing about sensitivities. I think that, let me start with political correctness. I think that at this point, political correctness is a very serious problem. Now, it's a serious problem because it is an attempt to solve or offer a solution to a serious problem, which is everything from racism to paranoia. And you want to reduce the place of paranoid voices and of hateful voices within the public sphere. In that sense, political correctness is a way of showing respect. On the other hand, when political correctness becomes a kind of messianic solution in which if you can just silence the voices of hatred in the public sphere, then somehow you've gotten rid of hatred, while in fact you're fostering it and not noticing it, then you're in serious trouble. And I think we are now in a situation where we're afraid to talk about terribly serious and important things, to take the bull by the horns in terms of our discussion here this evening about Islam. When I was 2001, after 9/11, I had some Fox interviewers in my office asking me what I thought. I said, you know, Osama bin Laden is an apocalyptic messianic. This is global jihad. This is an apocalyptic messianic movement. And they said, no, that's impossible. And I said, why not? And I said, because Islam is a religion of peace, which is something that the President of the United States said and has been repeated particularly by various figures of some influence from John Esposito in the Academy to Karen Armstrong. I think that basically historically the evidence is that Islam registers as historically, in terms of evidence, one of the more belligerent religions in the history of the planet. Now that doesn't mean there aren't other religions with belligerent traditions, but this was one that, you know, registers fairly high on this scale. We need to be able to talk about it. We need to be able to talk about the fact that today, when a moderate Muslim and a jihadi encounter each other, very often, if they discuss the text, the Quran, the Hadith, and the legal text, the jihadi has the text in his favor. And I think that that's something that we need to address, because if we don't, and if we listen to people who present themselves as moderate Muslims when in fact they're not, when in fact they hold profoundly jihadi beliefs about how the entire world needs to be under Sharia, then we're in trouble. So I would say that political correctness, to the degree that it makes it impossible for us to distinguish between false moderates and true moderates, for us to discuss the belligerent dimensions of the Islamic world and the hate speech that pervades public discourse in the Islamic world, whether it's the newspapers or the TV shows or the sermons, I think not being able to discuss this is a catastrophe.
Well, a very good answer, if I may say, but to the question that you were not asked. You were asked about racism and bigotry and prejudice and correctness, and you instead gave an answer about violence and eschatology. And while you were at it, you could have said that the eschatology of all religion, the reason why the term eschatology exists, and you're supposed to be the millennial idea of the president, is that all religions hope that the world is coming to an end. They want this veil of tears to close.
Some more than
all of them, some more than others, some in more different ways, but they all want it. Right? This is merely a prelude. This pure bullshit life we're having now. We can't wait for it to be over for the last things to occur: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. The apocalypse. It's the reason why Jews who hate Christians get together in Washington, next door to me at Washington Hilton, every other week, with Christians who hate Jews, to discuss how to bring about the end of days by giving enough American weaponry to Israeli settlers to bring on Armageddon. I'm serious. It happens all the time in my hood. You laugh, and I'm okay. Well, basically, I'm trying to be, if not funny, frivolous. Right. But not flippant. This is serious. These deeply Jew-baiting Christian thugs, whose theology says, and you've read the End Times books, these appalling, and if you haven't, you should, unreadable though they are, say, well, about 100,000, 125,000 Jews will be saved in the apocalypse. The rest of them will be part of the human sacrifice that brings Jews back. So they support Judaism, like, as Lenin used to say, as the robe supports the faith. Now, no monotheistic religion is complete without St. John the Divine or some God. So you cannot discern it. You can't simply say another religion is more death cult oriented than yours is. They're all death cults. All of them are. They all want this to be over. And this, alas, I have to tell you, this is the only life we're going to have. This is it. So those who want you to die, and those who want human life to come to an end, are not your friends. Get used to this. be glad you live in a secular republic that says you don't have to listen to people like this, and they have no right politically to inflect our law or our constitution. That's very, very important. And get ready to fight for it, not as a matter of principle, but as a matter of survival. For yourself, your families, the descendants you may not have yet, but you may be hoping. To defend yourself against monotheistic fascists and pessimists and people who are life haters and death lovers. Because they're everywhere. They don't just come flourishing the Quran. That's the first thing. The second is that racism is a separate question. Genocide is the genocide, the religious one, the end of the whole human species. Conceived in sin. Conceived in sin. Made, as the Christians tell you, out of a clot. No, excuse me, as the Muslims say, out of a clot of blood. A contemptible clot of blood. As the Christians will tell you, out of a mere piece of dust, filth. Conceived in sin. Loathsome. Soon to be condemned. Filthy, disgusting. In other words, how do they explain this paradox? Created sick, and yet ordered on pain of death, eternal punishment, to be healthy. This is the totalitarian system of hatred and death and filth that the religious want to impose upon you. Well, you have the right to reject it. You have the right to say you're free. You have the right to say that it's a man-made dictatorship. This is an imaginary tyranny. That is a mind-forged manacle, in beautiful words of the original first declaration of freedom you can make. That every human democratic revolution from England to France to America ever has made is to say no. We reject the origins of dictatorship and totalitarianism, which is the opposite. We say no. Non serviam. We will not be service. This should have been the first question. Because that no, is the first thing under the sun. Once you have declared yourself free and independent of democracy, then the discussion can begin. Until you have done it, you remain in the medieval condition in which they want to keep you, and to which they would like you to pay taxes, tithes, and other duties. And if you're wise, you will repudiate this.
Allow me to move on. Professor Reines, in his book, The End of Illusions, Joseph LeConte writes that prior to World War II, the so-called pacifists would use moral instances for the justification of inaction. For example, he cites the American left who would use lynchings in the South to equate the United States with Germany and its war crimes. And similarly, the English left who, quote, dredged up every fault of England since the Norman Conquest and said we were its moral trials. In my view, and I'd like to know your perspective on this, the same thing appears to be happening in Israel, equating Palestinian terrorists, murderers, with Israeli armed forces. Do you agree with this assessment of moral equivalence?
A couple of things about moral equivalence. I actually have an essay on it at my blog, The Archaean Stables. I think moral equivalence is a very serious problem. When I was your age, it was we're as bad as the Soviets. Anybody who's read George Orwell understands that that's newspeak. What I see today is actually something that goes even further as a kind of moral inversion, which is it's not just that George Bush is as bad as Osama bin Laden, George Bush is worse than Osama bin Laden. So, at that point, I think you've completely lost your moral compass, and I think that in particular, again, I go back to the fact that I'm still alive, and there are men and women in this room. Modernity is modern world of democracy and free speech and free exchange. It's an absolutely extraordinary accomplishment. It's literally a kind of, excuse me, Christopher, a kind of miracle. It's a social miracle. And I would argue was inspired by people who read the Bible in a certain way, which was not a death-seeking way, but a life-seeking way. Not all religion is death. self-criticism is a fundamental dimension of the modern world. We wouldn't have science if scientists weren't willing to listen to people criticize them, and when they're shown that they're wrong, actually change their mind. In fact, the definition of an intellectual comes from the Dreyfus affair, when people were presented with the evidence about Dreyfus, looked at it and said, he's innocent. The empirical evidence says he's innocent, even though I'd like to believe that he's guilty. That's an intellectual, somebody who's ready to respond to feedback from reality and self-criticize the worldview or the approach or the beliefs that they have. So in that sense, I think that self-criticism is absolutely crucial. But when you get a kind of what I call masochistic omnipotence complex, which is it's all our fault, and if only we were better, everything would be okay, then you get things like this performance artist from Italy who decided that she and her friend, 30-somethings, would hitchhike from Italy to Jerusalem in wedding gowns, and trusting wherever they were in the world as they made their way there, they would show that if you're nice to people and show them respect, they'll show you respect. And she is now raped and strangled and dead. And you could have guessed that, and I think that this idea that somehow all cultures are the same undersells the extraordinary moral accomplishment of the West. So I think that moral equivalence is a kind of moral insanity. It's a generosity. It says, I'll self-criticize first. Well, okay, if you self-criticize first and the other side self-criticizes, fine. But if you self-criticize and the other side says, I told you you were a bastard, I always knew you were a colonial, imperialist, racist, good for nothing, when they have just as much of an awful history of racism and imperialism and so on, then you're making a big mistake. And by the way, I would say that the great prophet of this kind of moral equivalence that literally uses our own desire to be self-critical against us is Edward Said's Orientalism. If you look at how the world that he says we're looking down on looks at us, you have to acknowledge we make a hell of a lot more of an effort to find out what they're about than they make to find out what we're about.
On the point of moral equivalence, where I think we in principle agree, I don't think you have the proportions right. But let me just say, for an example, I say in 1899, 1898, long argument in Paris, Captain Dreyfus is innocent. He's been framed by the church, by the army, and by the state, and because he's a Jew. And that those who've done this are willing to admit that they're wrong. They'll know they're wrong, but they still won't agree because of the principle that such a person mustn't be found innocent. And that the state, the church, and the army must be exalted is more important than the innocence of one man.
Right, but honor.
And I think morally I win that argument by definition. But what I would not say is what they would say to me. They would say, no, you're just not wrong. You're going to hell. You will be punished, tortured, eternally, at God's punishment for being wrong. As will all your Jewish friends for doing wrong. Now, excuse me, we are not.
Right.
As wrong as I couldn't be that wrong. Dinesh D'Souza, who I think has been here recently, with whom I've debated many times, has published a book. I'm going to Long Beach, California to debate him on, I think it's Wednesday. It won't be the first, it won't be the last time. In his book he says, think carefully about this, about your belief in God. Because an abstention vote will, on the day you die, be counted as a no vote. And you may be punished. Wait, just a minute. Now, I've debated with a lot of Reaganites and other punks in my life. And I'll tell you this. I will not be talked to in this tone of voice. I'm serious. I'm talking about something you ought to have got the first time I said it. I will not be bullied and blackmailed by totalitarian fascists and Stalinists. I will not be told, if I lose this argument, I go to a torture center, not for the rest of my life, but forever. I won't be tortured in that tone of voice. Now, do you get this or don't you? Because I think it's very important. You see, I don't say, if you don't agree that there is evolution by natural selection, you are going to be hung up by your thumbs.
Wait a minute, Chris.
Do I? Wait a minute.
Do I?
I'm asking for fairness from your end. Do I? No, but you don't understand that who in our argument, on the side of our argument against theism and theocracy ever says, watch out, you don't agree with us. We have worse for you than the disgrace of the stupidity that you'll find out you've been harboring in your argument. No, much worse than that. An eternity of torture awaits you. We don't talk about this. We don't, and they do. And then we're told we must respect them because they're people in faith. You haven't got it yet. It hasn't sunk into you yet. We won't be tortured. No one at a decent university with an open mind, hoping for a career of study and an honest debate on major matters, because not everything about natural selection and evolution has yet been decided, can be addressed by anyone who says, get this wrong and we'll torture you and your children to death forever. That is the voice of fascism, and it is, I think, a responsibility of all those who believe in the idea of a free mind, a free society, and a free university to say, no, we start without that. We, on our side, don't bring that kind of pressure or blackmail to bear. Now, I'm sorry it took me so long to say this, but it was a little incredulity as if, well, we don't do it either. Yes, they do. That is what the religious suggest. Dinesh D'Souza, I will show him what I think. When he debates me in a few days, I say. As far as he's concerned, I'm sitting debating him, and he's sitting here debating me, except he has a gun pointed to my head and my children's head, saying, if we lose this debate, we're all going to die. I will not always let him know how much I despise the mentality, but I want you to know, I want you to have a clue as to how objectionable a reasonable person ought to think that is. Well, I hope I haven't wasted my time making this point.
Right. So we agree on moral equivalence.
No, we don't, because you have not distinguished moral equivalence from relativism. I'll give you an example.
Okay.
What's happened with political correctness is this. Political correctness says everyone's views are okay.
Right.
You're okay, you're a feminist. I'm a queer person. I'm a transvestite. I'm a prostitute. We're all fine. We all have our own club. Good, why not? So it's infinitely extended. So now a group wants to form a university says, and we are the Muslim League Club. Fine. The gorgeous mosaic has just added one new lovely little tile. What could be more lovely? Now note the difference between multiculturalism and relativism. That club says the Jewish club and the Hindu club and the secular club shall be killed. That's not adding to the gorgeous mosaic, is it? It's subtracting these three groups. Two of them, including me, I might add, not that I'm self-pity, it's not adding to multiculturalism. To include and say inclusive is a jihadi group. It says all Hindus, all Jews, all secularists, and quite often, by the way, all Shia Muslims and all Ahmadi Muslims. And any other Muslims should also all be killed just for existing. No, that's the difference between multiculturalism and relativism. Get it now, or get it later.
Right.
Get it rubbed into you, or work it out for yourselves.
I agree with you.
Don't waste any time pretending that everyone's okay. Because that will be literally lethal.
We all have standards.
That will be literally lethal.
Okay.
Yeah, well, it needs to be rubbed in.
Okay. They may be
I
smarter
don't mind
than you
being
think.
more about this in case.
Christopher, they may be smarter than you think.
Who are we talking about here?
The audience.
I wouldn't want to condescend, but
Okay.
because I had the feeling of something sinking in against a certain multicultural relevance. If I was wrong, I'd be so happy to be wrong. I'd be so happy to be wrong, but I had the feeling that no one wants to say now what they think about this. But what I don't want to hear tonight either. I'd like to hear what they think tomorrow. Give yourself time to think.
Next week.
You should know, I think you will know, that there are people who want to use your rhetoric and your best instincts of kindness, welcoming, pluralism, and whatnot. They want to use it to take away everything you've got and destroy everything you've got.
Well, isn't that...
And you should be aware that that's happening. And don't let them use your decency against. Don't say anything till the day after. Then you can email.
Well, I'll direct this to Richard on, isn't that what has allowed radicalism to flourish in Europe, in particular, because liberal democracies can allow the flourishing of radicalism. That is the fallacy of liberal tolerance. And that is, say what you want about Stalin's dictatorship, but if there's a group that they believe is pernicious to the government, they can do away with it. But in democracy, it doesn't work like that.
Well, what Christopher described at the end of his talk is what I call a demo path. In other words, somebody who comes to you and says, oh, we're all here for human rights and we're all here for mutual respect, and you need to respect me, while in fact he's not particularly committed either to human rights and mutual respect, but in fact planning to either get rid of you or subordinate you. And that's something that you need to be aware of and you need to deal with and you need to challenge. I'm not saying that you walk around paranoid and say every Muslim who comes to me and says I believe in tolerance and human rights is a fake, but you will meet Muslims who say that to you and they're not being straightforward with you. And you need to protect against that. And I think that's a terribly important thing for you to learn about. It's a terribly important thing to discuss, and political correctness and moral equivalence does that. Now, as to your question to me, you were saying that in Europe you have a problem, which is that there is I mean, if you think it's bad in America, I don't know how many of you think political correctness is bad in America, but if you think it's bad in America, it's a whole lot worse in Europe. I mean, there are just a whole range of things you cannot say in Europe without being completely ostracized, having no moral audience. Right. Okay, so, and this, I think, is related to a form of cowardice. In other words, the key moment in all this, the key moment in our current dilemma, the opening round was not so much, you can say it was the hostage-taking and Carter's response in 79, but really in 89, when Khomeini put out a fatwa on Salman Rushdie for writing a book that was, obviously from a Muslim point of view, a critical book, and put out a fatwa on it, and he was not protected. And the sort of Western intelligentsia didn't come to his defense and say, this is absolutely outrageous and unacceptable. That was, you shouldn't have provoked it. And this is a form of appeasement, which is catastrophic for the very values that we value. So, yeah, Europe's in trouble. I'll stop there.
Are you in agreement?
Well, I realized that your argument about the question about Israel I hadn't directly answered. So rather than have anyone think I was bluffing about it, I thought I should say, if anyone's got a notebook, they could look up a very famous film play, a very famous writer, Dalton Trumbo, later blacklisted, famous Hollywood blacklisted writers. Leftist of the 1930s, T.R.U.M.B.A. Dalton. And he wrote, before he was blacklisted, he wrote a very famous play that was made into a film called Johnny Got His Gun. It's about an American soldier who was deprived of all his senses in the First World War. He's hit by a shell, he can't speak, he can't hear, but he can hear, he can't speak, he can't move, he can't register. But he's lying in a bed and he knows what's going on while people cluster around his bed. He can't talk back to him. It's a terrible long torture. So one of the ghastliest things you can imagine happening to that. It became the great anti-war play of the 1930s. And Trumbo was very upset when he found at the end of the 1930s that the anti-Roosevelt, anti-New Deal, pro-Franco, pro-Hitler, pro-Mussolini fascist organizations were using his play and his book and his film as a recruitment. Don't get involved. That's not, I didn't mean that. How does he know that? Beware of the unintended aesthetic consequences of what you do. And beware above all of moral equivalence. Beware of the shallowness of comparing the unlike with the like. The only chance you have in this country now of being a racist and being able to continue public life. I think that the two things ought to be incompatible. I don't think you can or should be a racist and be in public life. The only way you can be a racist and be in public life in the United States now is by putting the word reverend or rabbi in front of your name. If you like, I'll give you examples, but if I'm not wrong, any intelligent, thoughtful person here will have already worked that out. You can do it on that condition. Ought this not to mean that we ought to reconsider our view that being faith-based is a good thing in itself? I think that it's bloody well.
Before we go down this path, I have one last question that I'd like to direct at Mr. Hitchens. And this isn't exactly related to what we're talking about, but we did previously discuss the indignity of certain religions as a result of alienation from their more present past. And on a very loosely related subject, I'd like to ask you a more general question about the, I guess, the sanctity or dignity of man. And that is that Ayn Rand describes man as a supreme being of sorts, and she does loathe, even though she is an atheist, she loathes the prospect of kneeling or prostrating oneself. It always has her protagonist stand up straight and the antagonist bent over and twisted. Now, in your book, God is Not Great, you also take issue with prostrating himself, but you also, on the other hand, often refer to people in a way to diminish their significance as mammals in many of your articles. Now, irregardless of the influence of a supreme being, do you regard man to be a supreme being? Do you agree with Ayn Rand's view on humanity?
No, I'm not a Randian at all. I'm not one to make a cult of the worship of, especially her trope of the Superman person, Superman, actually, as it always was in my case, like that. Sinister and shady.
Even with the absence of the supreme being.
With or without, because it's possible to be a Superman cultist and also monarchist. But I suppose what I think about the whole antagonism is that there is a sadomasochistic advenitia, in other words. There is the will to obey and the will to worship and the will to submit and the will also to be God. And these are primate, mammalian inheritance that comes to us not from God or from any holy book, but from nature. And it's the part of ourselves that we should most distrust. It is not wholesome for a human being to ask to be adored by his fellow creatures. Though he will always get fans and followers if he does. And it's not wholesome to be among those who can't wait to sprawl at the feet of some idol or some god or some temple or some scene of sacrifice. The way that the humans grow out of mammalian primate inheritance, so you have to become, as it were, or earn the title of being human, is by saying that, as Mr. Lincoln used to put it, as I would not be a slave, I would not be a master. Everyone in this room is going to have to work out that proposition for themselves and grow up and think and feel for themselves and not expect anything to be given to them. As you would not be a slave, you would not be a slave. Sounds easy in the banal decade in which we live. No, it isn't easy at all. You have to have decided this for yourself. You're going to be a worshipper. Would you want to be someone who is worshipped? Or could you possibly declare independence as a human and say, I will do my own thinking. At any risk, I'll do my own. And I'll face any judgment and say, at least I tried to think and reason and read for myself. If you can't do this, why are you at university? In the hope it'll get you a job? In the hope it will increase your income? What are you doing here if that isn't what you are primed to do? If that isn't what you lay your life on? Well, that's what I came here to say. So thanks for letting me do so.
All right. I guess we can take a couple questions before we call it evening. And I guess you can direct them either to Roberts.
Do you take it as a sign of progress or concealment that you're debating a very moderate and friendly opponent versus someone like, well, an apologist asking someone like Abraham Cooper?
The question was heard by all, but was it? There should be a roving mic. The question very kindly and sweetly asked me, how did I feel debating someone as furry and sweet as my vis-a-vis, instead of some raging fundamentalist, and like you mentioned Ibrahim Cooper, but it could have been. Well, I always say I'll debate anyone who will debate with me, who's kind enough to spend the evening doing that. I don't, therefore, ever get the chance to set up straw men. Certainly tonight's one. I've debated everyone from Hugh Hewitt's show to Georgetown University, the chosen representative by their side of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church, several rabbis and imams. I let them be the ones who nominate opposition. And, well, you can look it up on YouTube. You be the judge.
If I could address your question about whether it's progress or not, I think both styles of discussion have value. In other words, it's important to debate people who disagree with you, but it's also important to talk through things with people who share a fair amount of your attitude so that you can explore stuff. If you spend all your time trying to get from point A to point B, you're not making any progress. So occasionally, the idea of talking with somebody who shares your basic outlook, but who wants to explore things not necessarily from the same point of view, is an extremely valuable exercise.
Directed towards Mr. Landis. On the question of suicide bombers, which are becoming an increasingly horrible thing present in the Middle East, what would be your best possible way to, I guess, not make them stop, but be able to re-educate people so they don't just want to senselessly blow themselves up for whatever purpose, because you see, you're getting all these volunteers who want to do it.
All right. On the subject of suicide bombers, how do we deal with them? I think the first thing to understand is that, first of all, I think I would say, and being a sort of millennial historian interested in both millennialism from a sort of messianic apocalyptic point of view and also millennialism from a chronological point of view, I basically specialize in the period from 1000 to 2000. I would say that the bane of the 21st century is suicide terrorism. We have some examples before 2000, but essentially it's since 2000 that this thing is metastasized. And it metastasized, it's very important to understand that the earliest manifestations of suicide bombing that became really successful and replicated rapidly were greeted with enormous enthusiasm, not only in the population of people who were claimed to be represented by the suicide bombers, and here we're talking about Palestinian public, because in the 1990s when there were suicide bombers, it was a minority of the Palestinian public that supported them, but after 2000 it was 70 and 80% that supported it. But also in Europe you have, and among the left, I mean not among the left sort of celebration of it, but no real denunciation of it. So that for the first 3-4 years of suicide bombing, you have enormous popularity to the people who engage in it and to the people who represent those causes. Now, given that situation, suicide bombing becomes a sort of, it's useful. It makes sense. It has success. It galvanizes people, it terrifies people, and it gains support from unexpectedly large bodies of people. I think the important thing is that we regain our moral sense. I mean, I think that the left essentially went crazy in 2000 when you get this suicide bombing and you've got, as Oriana Fallaci denounced, these crowds of leftists in Europe who are walking out with models wearing suicide belts saying, all glory to the Palestinian revolution, when in fact they were cheering on the first stages of 21st century jihad. So I think it's terribly important for these things. There was no outrage, there was no moral outrage. I had a colleague who said, I said, what kills me about this wave of suicide bombing is there's no moral outrage. He said, well, what choice do they have? Well, what kind of a morally imbecilic remark is that? Everybody has choice. What do you mean, what choice do they have? It's like poverty causes terrorism. These things make no sense, but they sound good, so we repeat them. And we literally undermine our very civilization in doing so. And we think that we're being morally generous.
Bravo, except I would say that it's bad, which is what I say. I will now give you a remark. And I'll ask you to guess who made it. The remark is about a nuclear war. And what would happen if there was one. And the person commenting on it says, the worst that would be that people entered the kingdom of heaven where they're going in any case, a little earlier than they would otherwise. So that was the comment of a figure on the question of thermonuclear extermination. Does anyone want to guess who said that?
Is this translated into English?
It was said in English.
It was said.
You see, I knew. It was said in English. Why was it said in English? It was said by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher.
But not even the present one.
That's what the Archbishop of Canterbury said when asked. In my life, I remember it. Well, what else could he say? I already have spoken about eschatology. It is essential to religious belief that the desire for the end of this veil of tears and sin and misery and the original dirt and shame come to an end. The purifying moment arrives sooner or later. Who cares if it comes soon? Why does anyone with a religious conscience care if it happens sooner? And if it should come in a wonderfully seeming, flowery, beautiful form, such as that lovely flower, leaving so little to bother us. Surely so much the better. Take it or don't take it. Don't say that isn't what religion insists upon, that is why the term eschatology exists. Now, as for suicide, well, okay. But where does the word martyr? Had you not heard the word martyr before you heard the word shaheed? You'd heard the word martyr. You've heard it a lot of times. Someone whose whole bliss was to die for the faith, and to take as many with him as he could. You'd heard it from the Crusades. You'd heard it from Masada. You'd heard it said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
They did not
I yield to very few people dislike and contempt for the Muslim religion. But I won't have it said that they invented the idea of martyrdom or shaheed, or the idea of self-sacrifice, especially if it involves the murder of oneself and others, and the death that the death is to be preferred than life. You will not have it said then.
All right,
Christians and Jews, that's not Islam.
All right, I rarely correct people publicly, but I gotta say that Christian martyrs died not taking with them as many people as they could. The first Christian martyr of that kind to be called a martyr in the text is Roland in the Song of Roland, who dies surrounded by the enemies that he's slain. But the notion of martyrdom, the blood that built the church, was not built on aggressive suicide. It was built, in a sense, if you want, it was built on masochistic rather than sadistic suicide. But let's distinguish.
I rest my case. This is the diseased mentality of those who believe in the number. Okay. There's no escape. All right. You must either decide that you subscribe to it or that you do not. You must either be master or slave, sadist or masochist, or refuse the alternative and live for life and for the free intelligence.
By the way, there is one more.
You haven't got a lot of time to make up your mind because the life you do have is going to big attempts are being made short-lived by the faithful, who ask that you respect them meanwhile. Up to you.
By the way,
to you.
Before we go to the next question, there's one thing that I want to interject in.
They want respect on top. It's a lot to ask, isn't it?
By the way, you mentioned that people want to be in submission to a religion. This is something that they want to be now.
Surrender.
Is this something that you attribute to religion, or as the creators of South Park would say, to people themselves, and that in the absence of religion there would be something else? There would be different leagues of atheists, of scientists.
I think that people, quite a lot of people want to lick the boots and the feet of God, and the religion that has a natural advantage and that it can capitalize upon the abject and the mindless and masochistic, of course. To that extent, I do have some sympathy with Ayn Rand, even with Friedrich Nietzsche. But this isn't the whole story. Religion should at least acknowledge that is what it is doing. And socialist votaries, after all, I mean, just take an obvious example. The Christians actually describe themselves as wrong.
Mostly the
and their bishops describe their followers as sheep. Now, I used to think when I was quite small, having to attend an Anglican, this is remarkable. They say for themselves that they are sheep and that their priests are shepherds, and that they are a flock. Can any further degree of degradation, has anyone ever worked with sheep? Is anything prepared you to the miserable stupidity and nothingness of the sheep? Now, a shepherd may be deemed to be looking after a flock, protecting a flock from wolves, etc., but not for its own sake. What are they doing? With their sheep. They're going to fleece them, and then they're going to kill them. And with some shepherds, in the meantime, they're going to fuck them. The picture has become a lot more vivid than it is pastoral past. We have a pope who protects people through the third. Up to you. You can join this gang or you can stay out of it.
Next question.
All right, thank you very much. I actually had...
Fuck, feast, and finish.
Thank you very much.
Say no, nice.
As a sheep, I'd like to ask a question.
Come here, baby. Come on.
It deals with martyrdom. Now, I trust that you probably won't answer my question anyway. You haven't answered one yet tonight. But if you choose to, first, the Song of Roland, Christian martyrdom. Roland was a soldier defending France when he died, and he fell in an ambush. He didn't initiate the contact, so to say that he was a martyr going to take lives is falsification.
I didn't say he was.
Well, you sort of did.
No, he didn't.
Well,
He said any martyr he would recognize as Roland.
well, in any case, that was the case. But here's my other question is this. Earlier in the discussion, actually very early on, you said that religion is the root of totalitarianism and fascism.
Yes.
Now, how can you argue that if there are many totalitarian regimes, such as that of Hitler, Maoist China, the Soviet Union, which were atheists and anti-religious, still carried out these great atrocities? When Hitler himself said Judaism is the cause of Christianity, and Christianity is the worst thing ever to happen to humanity. How can we make that argument that it's not humanity, but that it's religion?
You got better as you went along.
Yeah, can I answer the first part about the Roland the martyr?
Sure.
Okay, Roland, the whole thing about Roland, this is honor shame stuff, and if you're interested, I have an essay on Roland and bin Laden, which I wrote shortly after 9/11. Roland chooses not to blow the horn and avoid the conflict that he's going to die in. He essentially chooses his own suicide. He makes a suicidal move so that he can show his glory by killing as many of the enemy as possible. Don't try and save him for Christianity. Yes.
Well, and by the way, on Martin's question, some people appear to imply martyrdom by acting with such disregard for their own safety that they must be pretty certain they're going to die if they don't actually commit suicide. There's nothing that seems to me Roland and his rival Oliver that couldn't have been done by a brave soldier for any religion or none in his time. Martyr, and I didn't propose him is what I meant by martyr or shahid. My little room in Oxford when I was studying philosophy, looking down on the place where the martyr's memorial was, the Bishop Cranmer and Latimer and Ridley who burned and Hooper alive in the street because they were the wrong kind of Christian. But people thought they were the right kind of Christian. Most martyrdoms, remember, are inflicted on the religions by religious people. Most Muslims were killed last month were killed by other Muslims, or certainly the majority of Christians in history have been killed as martyrs by other Christians. It would be found actually if you went into it in the struggle between Jewish sects if the same thing was true. Their excommunication or killing of one another would be done by other fanatics. It's not secularists who do this, any more than it is secularists who blow up or desecrate religious buildings. So please be aware of how foolish you sound when you try and indict secularism in the way that you did. To answer your immediate question, Hitler had Mass said to him and his birthday celebrated in every pulpit in Germany every year till April 9th by order of the Pope. This, whatever it is not secularism. He and Mussolini and Franco were allowed into power by concordats, official political concordats with heads to be back. If you read any article, I'll make this a challenge to anyone here. Go to your library, look up any article from the 1920s and 1930s from Europe, Eastern, Central, Western, or Mediterranean Europe, where the word fascism appears. Look it up. Substitute for that one word 2 words. 3, the Catholic right wing. 4. Okay, Catholic right. There is no article or essay where you need to change anything else if that's the change. That's it. That's all. That's what fascism is. It's the name of it. The National Socialism wouldn't be as exact. Not as exact. Any more than was the attitude of the papacy. But it would be pretty clear. Paul Johnson, Catholic historian, says that more than 40% of the Waffen-SS were confessing Catholics. The Pope said he didn't try and excommunicate any of them because he didn't want to alter their allegiance in the fight against communism. In other words, nobody was ever excommunicated or threatened with excommunication, taking part in the final solution, which borrowed, as you all know, from Christian anti-Semitism, which had blamed the Jews for the death of Christ and for much else since the dawn. It was then an official Catholic doctrine. That is not to say that the Church could not excommunicate. Joseph Goebbels was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Do you know why? Do you know why? Well, you should have asked yourself before you asked me your stupid question. Joseph Goebbels was excommunicated from the Catholic Church because he married a Protestant, Magda Goebbels. She was not just a Protestant, she was a divorced Protestant. Excuse me, the Catholic Church has its standards. They know when enough is enough. And next time, you'll know not to do it. Now, you want to ask me about communism? How much time have you got? I'm not in a hurry to go to bed.
Let me just
No, I'm serious.
Christopher, can I say?
No, I'm very serious. Until 1917, the Tsar of Russia had been considered by millions of people for hundreds of years to be a supernatural figure. If you were the head of the Russian state, you were above the church, more than just its head. You were between heaven and earth. You were a supernatural figure. Head of the church, the whole of serfdom, slavery, and I might add, the people who invented the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the people who invented anti-Semitism as well, head of the church, as well as head of the state. Millions of Russian peasants were told that for hundreds of years. If you're Joseph Stalin and you take over power in Russia, if you're interested in the totalitarian principle, don't you want to borrow from this fantastic inheritance? You'd be mad if you didn't say, yes, I too can proclaim miracles. Lysenko's biology. We can grow 3 vegetables a year. I too have an inquisition that hunts out the heretics. I too have show trials and the abolition of the enemy without. I too must be the one who is thanked for everything that happens in the country that is good, and my enemies must be blamed, my secret enemies for everything. It's an exact replica, of the religious and czarist and feudal and religious worldview. Now, if you were to ask me, or propose to me, and I'll end on this, do you propose a society anywhere in the world that adopts the principles of Spinoza and Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and Bertrand Russell and Lucretius and Albert Einstein and Carl Sagan, that adopts these secular, humanistic, agnostic, atheist principles, does that, and falls into serfdom and slavery and war and famine, then I'll agree you propose a level playing field. Until then, you're just dicking around, and that would be the test, and that's why they won't do the test. That's why they won't do it.
We're doing the test right now.
They say
this is what we're warning.
They do. They talk as if Hitler was a secularist instead of a beneficiary of the Catholic right and Protestant.
Okay, beneficiary.
They talk as if Franco and Mussolini were secular. They talk as if totalitarianism was secular. And they fail to recognize the principle of totalitarianism, the worship on your knees of an absolute, unquestionable leader, of a Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung. Wasn't the problem to begin with. I've been in North Korea. It's the most religious state I've ever seen. You have the right to worship from dawn till dusk. It's all the only right you do. It's the most worshipful, confessional state there's ever been. There's nothing secular about it at all. It's one short of a trinity. Don't anyone dare tell me that's an atheist.
Let me just get one more question about
We're meeting here, this is an academic environment, but we're meeting here after classes in the dark. The purpose and the focus of this meeting is to discuss the availability of open discourse on subjects that otherwise might be found to be incorrect politically or inconvenient. As two academicians, are you confident that this type of discussion and discourse is going on in the American college classroom today, or is it not? Or is it under threat of being extinguished by the politically correct, by the tyrannical, by the religious? Can we have academic, intellectual freedom in America? Do we have academic intellectual freedom in the American state?
Can I go first? Please. I would invoke here the Emperor's New Clothes. I think that actually there's an American version of the Emperor's New Clothes, which is The Wizard of Oz. Don't pay attention to that, the man behind the curtain. And I think that America as a culture has got good, healthy instincts for saying the Emperor's name. Right now, I think that, particularly in Middle Eastern studies, the effect of Edward Said has essentially created a field which is failing to do the job that it should be doing. I mean, this isn't just that Middle Eastern studies professors are sort of, a waste of time, so don't even bother listening to them. This is lost opportunity costs. I mean, we're investing enormous sums of money into training people to understand and study the Arab and the Muslim world. And I think by and large, we are not really hearing the kind of information that we need to hear. And I think that there's very strong pressure not to talk about it. Now, does that mean that academia is all deadwood? No, I mean, I'm in academia, Christopher's in academia, and hopefully there is a conversation going. What I would say is I do think that by and large, the politically correct crowd has had a tendency to ostracize anybody who disagrees. Even if you change your mind, all of a sudden you're out there nowhere. And one of the things that we know about, for instance, American communists who are not being threatened by the totalitarian system, even after they realized that Stalin and Stalin's Russia was a nightmare, didn't say anything because they were afraid of the loneliness of saying something and being ostracized by all of their friends. So in that sense, I think that, here I think I agree with Christopher. You cannot be free if you're not willing to be lonely. That doesn't mean that you'll be lonely all your life, but it does mean that you have to be willing to be lonely in order to explore paths that other people disapprove of. And in that sense, I think that there probably isn't enough of that there's too much of an instinct in the American scene, but it's even worse in Europe, of following the sort of cue that you get from the courtiers. And I think it's embarrassing. I mean, I personally think that as a historian, when people look back from the middle of the century and they say, who are some of the great intellectual figures of the late 20th, early 21st century, and it's Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, we're in terrible trouble. This is an intellectual catastrophe. I'll stop there.
Well, not looking for consensus, as you know. I have to say how much I agree with what you said, the tone in which you said that. And I did produce a book about almost 20 years ago now, with Jill, very good, about the then very much neglected subject of the human rights of Palestinian people. I wouldn't take back anything I said about it, but I did find, as did Edward, I can't ventriloquize him, of course, posthumously. I shouldn't try, but I do feel I'm able to say that I know he became alarmed at the use that was made in the capital of his Orientalism work and his other critiques, that he found that it was hardening into a practice whereby only a woman can pronounce on women's studies, say. You can see how the analogy could be extended and was. But things would have to be prefaced with something neither of us would dream of saying. Some would say, well, as a Filipino woman, I think this, or as a, rather than this is what I think. Or even worse, people would start to say, as a X or Y, whatever it might be, I feel. Well, I think, but you can feel. Just emotion. Just simply say, it's my right to feel.
That's authentic.
Very bad.
Yeah.
Extremely bad. And I know, and I go to my grave saying that, and I can prove it actually, Edward hated that unintended consequences. And so should everyone, whoever has to put up with this. the academic and intellectual life is supposed to be hard work. It's not a matter of trying to make yourself feel better or to promote your own identity or anything of the sort. You have to look yourself in the eye and other people too and say that you've done lots of feeling, lots of thinking, and some research and some study of history of the art of the world. Otherwise, you should be very modest, like me.
And even if you work hard, you can afford to be modest.
No.
Final question.
Mr. Hitchens.
Professor, let's do.
I'm sorry. Two final questions.
Mr. Hitchens, when the Binghamton Review was advertising for this event,
I'm so sorry.
when the Binghamton Review was advertising for this
Yes.
event, they put up several posters with your picture around campus. Some of the students who I would put in that politically correct school have decided to draw swastikas in the forehead of your picture and write fascist under it and face in various ways. I was just wondering how you would respond to that.
Who's left unseen?
Yeah.
Really?
I'm the unknown. If they had known.
Well, I mean, I should, of course, take a very insouciant, laid-back view of it, of course, but I actually, I'm very upset. I don't want to gratify people, particularly, if they wanted to upset me. They have to that extent succeeded. I mean, I wouldn't think that things had sunk like that. And I'll say why I think so. In all the debates I have, you've been the judge of this, whether it's with religious people or people who have politically different opinions, opinions politically different from my own. I hope it's clear in advance from what I've written, and becomes clearer from the way I appear, what I think and who my friends are, the causes I hold dear, and so would be campaigning. And therefore, I think that the person who confuse me with a nationalist, let alone a national socialist, would be an illiterate. Believe me, it's very kind of you to endorse my view of myself, that I'm not, in fact, a national socialist. And thus, and of course, it's sad, and one feels sorry for people who are moral and intellectual illiterate, and Dorgans, and so on. It could be that they did that because they couldn't write. So they had to convey themselves by sort of graffiti and symbols. Had they wanted to put it in words, would have had extreme difficulty doing it in joined-up writing. But that, believe me, it's that thought that upsets me, not that they were trying to hurt my feelings, which I hope you've discovered are protected by fidelity.
If I could just
Anyway, thanks for asking.
Right. One piece to that. I think that what's going on there is a really good example of the way in which sort of politically correct thought police tries to ostracize people. In other words, putting that swastika up as a way of saying, don't listen to this man, he's a racist, he's a hater, he's a hate monger, so don't listen to him. Now, that's not the act of somebody who is committed to serious conversation. It's in fact the act of a demonizer, and the interesting thing about that is that if generally, I mean, we know what the protocol says, when Hitler was accusing the Jews of wanting to conquer the world and enslave mankind, that's exactly what he was planning, and people who put the swastika on Christopher Hitchens' face as a way of saying, don't listen to this man. I'm not saying that this is true, but you have to ask yourself, what are they saying amongst themselves? What kind of thoughts do they have about how to deal with dissent and so on? One of the striking things about the Muhammad cartoon controversy is that the very same people who were rioting the streets about the dissing of Islam by doing these cartoons were part of a culture in which the most ferociously vicious cartoons were being drawn about the West. Drawn about Jews, drawn about Israel, drawn about Christians, drawn about the United States. I mean, unbelievably vicious cartoon culture. And yet, they were screaming bloody murder about how unfair these cartoons were. So I think that when you see this kind of effort to stigmatize, and that's what it is, swastika on the forehead is a form of stigmatization, you're looking at an insecure person who's not ready to have a serious discussion.
Since you've been so generous, I just want to say one more thing. Self-critical. 40 years ago, 1968, I did once or twice try and break up with terribly embarrassed meetings at Oxford University and elsewhere by people who I thought were too pro-war, too pro-government, friends of the then Rhodesian white rebel regime and so forth. Did my stuff. And probably there was the old swastika or cry of fascist involved, I won't deny it. But I would have come to the meeting if they'd let me in, the government didn't, and shown my face and said to the person, this is what I think about you. And I don't see any of these people here. Unless any of them are. In which case, believe me, I'm all yours.
Someone's raising their hand. Well, last question.
And so I think that possibly may be the difference in that someone who had the nerve to do that to my picture should by now have said, have got up and said, I can't be in the same room as a Nazi. They should have had balls to do that. Want to do it, or want to be condemned forever as a wimp and a turd? Let's hear from this gentleman.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you for getting to distinguished people who can speak very good English. But I'm sorry to say, when you have a topic with Islam and Muslims, for all panels you should also have a speaker who is very knowledgeable on Islam and Muslims. Because it looks like both the speakers, even though it looks like they are against, one is they are talking like indifferent, they have their own point of view. But I can tell about each question range and what each the distinguished speakers have said and what each question has said. I can talk for that on hours. But the
So you think that in order for this
Muslim,
discussion to be legitimate, we have to have an Islamic scholar present?
someone who is not only, he need not be Muslim, but someone who is knowledgeable on Islam and Muslims. Because I'm sorry to say, even though we say we should objectively, we should discuss, we should, but what I mean to say is, as the speaker said, we are spending millions of dollars to know Arabic, to learn Arabic, but still the truth should come, you should hear Muslims. Not out of 1 billion Muslims, if 1 billion Muslims are jihadists, and 99 million Muslims, if they, you don't know what it is like. If they are, if they have condemned terrorism, because as the speaker said, jihadist has his text in his favor. No, not clearly. Have you read the Quran? See, in reference to context, no, you must have read, but with what intention? With a critical mind? There are references.
You would prefer the uncritical approach?
No. I welcome all the audience, everyone to learn and understand with a critical thinking. Come and, just because somebody like Steve Emerson or Daniel Pikes who don't want academic freedom to be brought to campuses,
Well, they do. That's why we have them speak to invite us.
So what I am telling you is, when Islam was powerful for so many centuries, where everybody doing suicide bombing, there is no discussion. Means even though how much I hate suicide bombing, I cannot tell you. But why the root cause of all this violence is not studied?
And the root cause.
Everybody is thinking it's because of Islam. Islam is more, okay, others have also got, some fundamentalists. For example, those who form abortion clinic, they also do it in the name of religion. But there is no radical Christianity, no radical, any other religion,
How can you
Just
possibly?
because,
How can you not listen to anything I said and say that I only
just
attack
because I self-criticize, 99 million Muslims are dead, but only that 1 million Muslims and Osama bin Laden company are deadly. But Islam is now the dead or deadly. It's a very dynamic religion. No research has gone into Quran. Whatever the media or the Hollywood, as Mr. D'Souza said, I read in the paper that Muslims have got only viewpoint of America or West through Hollywood movies. Same way in USA, people have got view of Islam only through Osama bin Laden or Khomeini or 5% or what the Hollywood is telling about jihad and what you academic people are telling.
Yes, yes.
Exactly, that's what it is.
I suppose it is possible, and it would be my fault, because I would have been so boring, and so stupid, and so dull, that you could listen to me, you could understand what I'd read, and believe that my critique of religion was only one monotheism. You could have so much surrender to your own self-pity that you thought I was only picking on your problem. But that would mean you were the only, I hope it would mean you were the only person in the room who thought I only disagreed with one religion. Is there, can I just ask, is there anyone else here who thinks that I only criticize as I single it out? Is there?
The topic was...
No, look, we've had it with you guys a lot. Now, self-pity, self-righteousness, and self-hatred. You won't listen to a criticism of yourself that you don't translate into some kind of grievance. Understand this. Look at what happened the other day. Osama bin Laden says, in a public address to all Muslims, if United Nations peacekeepers come to Darfur to rescue African Muslims from the mass murder inflicted on them by Arab Muslims, which is the only violence in Darfur, that it is the duty of all Muslims to kill these peacekeepers. You heard that, didn't you? Everyone heard this. Now you tell me why that statement, piling murder upon murder upon murder upon incitement to murder and terror, on existing genocide, how that can be blamed on conditions in Gaza.
And you believe that...
Tell me how. No, wait a minute, sir. You owe us an explanation. How is that because of Gaza or the Crusades? How is that? Just before you get up next to inflict upon us your tedious self-pity, ask yourself if there isn't something in the House of Islam that might better repay your criticism. Just do that and you'll be a better citizen. And a less boring questioner.
Thank you, everyone.